The HOA came to drain my spring water, the same spring I've tended for 40 years, right where my wife's ashes are scattered. The HOA president just stood there with a smug smile as her crew cut my lines. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "This water doesn't belong to you anymore." They wanted it for their fancy private pond. But what this power-hungry woman didn't realize is that she hadn't just declared war on an old vet. She had just unknowingly tapped into a chilling secret hidden underground that supplied our entire county. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments because you're about to see a tyrant's plan backfire spectacularly. And if you believe every homeowner has the right to live in peace, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss justice being served. The quietest part of the day is just before the sun clears the ridge. I've walked this trail every morning for 40 years. It's a ritual. The air smells like damp earth and pine, and from up here, you can see the whole valley wake up. My place is tucked into the hillside, shielded by a stand of old oaks my grandfather refused to cut. But the heart of it, the real reason this land has life, is the spring. It bubbles up from a fissure in the rock, clear and cold, steaming in the morning chill. I built the collection system myself back in '83, a simple gravity-fed design that fills an underground tank and waters everything from the garden to the small orchard I planted for my wife, Martha. It's more than just water. Martha loved this spot. Her ashes are scattered in the wildflowers that grow thick along the bank, the ones our granddaughter Hope picks every summer when she visits. This little piece of land, this spring, it's peace, it's memory, it's everything that's left. When I got back to my gate after my walk, something was stuck to the post, a piece of white paper flapping in the breeze, held down by a strip of thick packing tape. It was a notice, official looking, with a cheap logo at the top, Oak Ridge Meadows Homeowners Association. I'd never joined their little club. My land was here long before they ever graded their first road. I ripped the paper off. The words were cold, sterile, unauthorized water use. It said the HOA was asserting its rights over all ground and spring water sources within the development's catchment area, as per a bylaw I'd never seen. Effective immediately, they had begun an easement inspection and reclamation process. My blood went cold. Reclamation. That word felt like a violation. They weren't reclaiming anything. They were taking it. I didn't even go inside. I followed the muddy tracks. They weren't hard to find. A heavy truck had churned up the soil on the fire road that runs along the back edge of my property line. I could hear the clank of metal and low voices long before I saw them. I came through the trees and stopped dead. There, on my land, was a backhoe. A deep, ugly trench was sliced into the earth, and lying in the mud was a severed section of the 2-inch pipe I'd laid with my own hands decades ago. It was the main line from the spring to my tank. 2 men in dirty jeans and hard hats were working, fitting a new junction into the line. Standing over them, like a general surveying a battlefield, was a woman in a big sun hat, holding a clipboard to her chest. Darla Crenshaw, the HOA president. I'd seen her picture in the local paper once, cutting a ribbon for some new community gazebo. She had a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She saw me coming, and that smile got wider, but it was all sharp edges. "Morning," she chirped, as if she'd found me admiring her flower garden. "Just doing a little community improvement." The men with the wrenches stopped and watched me, their faces blank. "You're on my property," I said. My voice was low, steady. I learned a long time ago in Vietnam that the man who shouts has already lost. "And you've cut my water line." Darla looked down at the pipe, then back at me, and gave a little sigh, the kind you'd give a child who doesn't understand a simple rule. "Well, that's where you're mistaken, Mr. Collier," she said, tapping her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "This is an HOA easement, and this is community water." She waved a hand vaguely toward the spring. I could feel a hot knot tightening in my gut. "That spring has been in my family for 60 years, I said. "It feeds my home. I built this system. You have no right." One of the contractors let out a short, ugly laugh, which he tried to turn into a cough. Darla's smile tightened. She took a step closer, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper that was more insulting than a shout. "Look," she said, "the board has voted. The water is being rerouted to benefit the entire community. We're filling the new pond down at the clubhouse." She said it with such pride, as if she were announcing a cure for a disease. I just stared at her. A pond, a decorative man-made hole in the ground. She was killing the land my wife loved to fill a pond. "I'm telling you to stop," I said, looking from her to the men. "Pack up your equipment and get off my land, now." For a second, her mask slipped. The smile vanished, and her eyes went hard and flat. It was the look of a person who enjoys power, who has waited a long time to use it on someone. She took a breath, put the smile back on, and said the words that I'll never forget. She looked right through me and said, "This water doesn't belong to you anymore." Then she just turned her back on me and nodded to the contractors. "Finish up the valve connection, boys. We're on a schedule." She walked away, her boots leaving deep prints in the mud, never looking back. The men got back to work, avoiding my eyes. I stood there, watching them wrench my life's work apart, and felt a kind of helplessness I hadn't felt in 50 years. There was nothing I could do right then and there that wouldn't land me in the back of a squad car. They finished within the hour. They filled the trench with a few lazy scoops of dirt, leaving the ground scarred and torn. Then they loaded up their equipment and rumbled away, leaving behind only the smell of diesel and silence. I walked over to the open ditch. They'd installed a heavy brass valve. The handle was turned, diverting the flow away from my pipe and into a new line that ran downhill, toward their precious community. The water that fed my tanks, my orchard, the wildflowers over Martha's ashes, was now gurgling away to fill a rich woman's puddle. I went back to my pump house. The pressure gauge was already dropping. I opened the hatch to my main tank, the one I'd formed and poured myself. The water level, usually just a foot from the top, was already down by a third. The heart of my land was bleeding out, and they had walked away laughing. For a full day, I just watched. I watched the pressure in the pipes drop to nothing. I watched the level in the tank go down another foot. By evening, the drip from the kitchen faucet had slowed to a weak sputter. The land felt different, thirsty. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the sound of something dying. Anger is a hot, fast-burning fuel. It gets you moving, but it doesn't get you far. What I felt was colder and heavier. It was the weight of a promise I'd made to Martha, a silent one, to keep this place the way she loved it. Darla Crenshaw hadn't just stolen my water. She had trespassed on a memory, and that was a mistake. I spent that night not in my bed, but in my old workshop. It smells of sawdust and metal, the way a place of work should. Against the back wall are 4 filing cabinets, old steel ones that lock with a key. They're filled with a lifetime of work. Blueprints, schematics, municipal contracts, and field notes from my 40 years as a water systems engineer. Most of it was for the county, especially after the big drought back in '91. I was the guy they called when things went wrong, the one they paid to design the fallback systems, the emergency measures nobody ever saw but everyone depended on. I pulled out the old county surveys, massive sheets of paper that crackled when I unrolled them on my drafting table. These maps were from before Oak Ridge Meadows was even a name on a developer's proposal. It was just hills and creeks back then. I found my property line, marked in my own neat hand from decades ago. And there was the spring, noted as a primary groundwater source. I spent hours hunched over those maps, tracing the old lines with a calloused finger, cross-referencing them with handwritten ledgers filled with flow rates and pressure calculations. The coffee in my mug went cold, my back ached. But I kept going, driven by a flicker of a memory, a detail from a project I'd worked on long ago. It was a contingency plan, a fail-safe for the unincorporated parts of the county that weren't on the main water grid, a system designed to be invisible until the day it was needed most. And then I saw it. My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't a memory. It was right there, on a topographical survey from 1987. A series of faint dotted lines I had drawn myself. The spring on my land, my spring, didn't just feed my tank. It was the primary intake for something much, much bigger. The gravity-fed system I'd built was only the first step. Further down the hill, hidden deep underground, my line fed into a massive collector system, a network of perforated pipes and subterranean basins I helped design, that supplied 60% of the entire unincorporated county's emergency water reserve. It was the water for the fire department's rural substations. It was the backup for the clinic 2 towns over. It was the last line of defense for thousands of people in case of a fire, a drought, or a failure of the main municipal supply. And Darla Crenshaw, in her infinite wisdom, had just diverted it to fill her decorative pond. The next morning, I put on a clean shirt, tucked the survey maps and my own property deed into a portfolio, and drove down to the HOA office. It was in a sterile little building next to their pristine and now rapidly filling man-made lake. The office was all beige and fake plants. Darla was there, sitting behind a desk too big for the room, looking important. She saw me, and her smile was a thin, tight line. "Mr. Collier, I hope you're not here to cause more trouble." I didn't say a word. I just walked to her desk, opened the portfolio, and laid out the deed first, followed by the county survey map. I tapped my finger on the spring. "This is my land," I said, my voice even. "And this," I tapped the dotted lines that snaked across the page, "is where that water actually goes." She glanced at the papers with a look of profound boredom. She didn't even try to understand them. She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers under her chin. "Old maps don't mean much," she said smoothly. "The HOA filed a comprehensive land use amendment with the county registrar last month. All riparian and groundwater sources in the Oak Ridge catchment have been consolidated under community management. It's perfectly legal. It was corporate jargon, meant to sound impressive and final, meant to make me feel small. "That's not just my water," I said, trying to keep the urgency out of my voice. "You've tapped into the county's emergency reserve. You have no idea the risk you're creating." That's when she actually laughed, a short, condescending puff of air. "I don't care if you're Moses himself claiming you parted the seas. That spring is HOA property now." She slid a piece of paper across the desk toward me. It was an invoice. My name was at the top. The amount listed was $9,400. "That's for unmetered water usage, retroactive for 5 years, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Plus penalties. We expect payment within 30 days, or we will have no choice but to place a lien on your property." A lien. She was threatening to take my home, the home I built with Martha, the place my granddaughter thinks of as magic. I just stood there, staring at the numbers, the cold, calculated cruelty of it all sinking in. I had come with facts, with proof, with a warning that affected thousands of people, and she had met it with a threat and a bill. I carefully folded my maps, slid them back into the portfolio, and turned to leave. I didn't say another word. There was no point. Reason had left the building. As I walked out, I could see the water from the new pipe gushing into their pond. It was a monument to her ego. I drove home and walked up the trail to the spring. The steady, powerful flow I'd known my whole life was gone. Now, only a weak trickle ran into the bypass culvert they'd installed, the rest diverted to her grand project. My land was already starting to show the strain. The ferns along the bank were wilting. The soil felt dry and brittle under my boots. I looked at the wildflowers where Martha's ashes lay and felt a deep, profound helplessness. It felt like I was losing her all over again. They were erasing her, drop by drop. I stood there as the sun began to set, watching what was mine being wasted. The feeling of being wronged settled deep in my bones, not hot, but cold and hard, like granite. They had the paperwork. They had the power. They thought they had already won. But as I watched that water disappear down the hill, one thought became clear, solidifying in my mind. They don't know what they've done. Not yet. A week passed. The water in my tank was gone. I was hauling 5-gallon jugs from town just to make coffee and wash dishes. The wildflowers by the spring, Martha's flowers, were turning brown at the edges. The land was grieving, but I wasn't the only one. Down the road, the Millers got a notice taped to their door. Then, the Garcias. Water overuse fees. Fines for watering their small vegetable gardens. Their water pressure started to drop too. Old man Miller, who's lived here even longer than I have, told me his tap sputtered brown one morning. His wife, Sarah, had been feeling sick to her stomach for 2 days. Darla Crenshaw's little pond was full, sparkling in the sun like a jewel, but the families who had been here for decades were getting murky water and penalty notices. It wasn't about community. It was about control. Then the quiet war against me started. My mail began arriving already opened, the envelopes sliced with a neat, thin blade. One morning, I went to check my well, the old one I keep as a backup, and found the cover askew. Someone had poured a bag of gravel down it, ruining the pump. It was a petty, vicious act. Not just an attack on my property, but on my ability to survive out here. At night, things got worse. I started hearing noises from the trail up to the spring, a twig snapping, the scuff of a boot on rock. It was deliberate. They wanted me to know they were there, prowling the edges of my life in the dark. They thought it would scare an old man. They thought I'd break. But all it did was make the cold anger in my chest harder, denser. They were making it personal. Fear is a useless emotion. It clouds your judgment. Instead, I went back to my workshop. You don't fight bullies like Darla with shouting matches. You fight them with facts. You fight them with their own ugliness, captured and brought into the light. I had an old trail camera, the kind hunters use to watch for deer. I found a spot in a thick pine overlooking the new valve they'd installed on my pipe, where the trail was narrowest. It was invisible from the path. Then I went to work on something a little more precise. Using parts I had on hand, I rigged a simple pressure sensor and wired it to a silent alarm, a small blinking LED I could see from my bedroom window. If the flow or pressure in that pipe changed unexpectedly, especially at night, I'd know. For 2 nights, nothing happened. The little light on my windowsill stayed dark. Then, on the 3rd night, just after 2 a.m., it started blinking, a tiny, steady red pulse in the darkness. I didn't turn on any lights. I just sat in my chair and watched the little red eye, imagining what was happening up on the hill. The next morning, before the sun came up, I climbed the trail and retrieved the camera's memory card. Back in my workshop, I slid the card into my computer. The first few clips were just a raccoon sniffing around. Then, at 2:07 a.m., a figure walked into the frame. It was one of the contractors from the first day. He was nervous, constantly looking over his shoulder. He knelt down at the valve, but he didn't touch it. Instead, he pulled at a thick clump of weeds and exposed something I hadn't seen before. A secondary hidden valve, buried just under the surface. With a heavy wrench, he cranked it open. On the screen, I watched the water flow from the main diversion pipe surge, then divert again. This time into a much larger, buried pipe I never knew existed. He let it run for about an hour, then shut it off, carefully replaced the turf, and disappeared back down the trail. My mind started working. Where was that pipe going? It wasn't pointed toward the HOA pond. It was going in a different direction entirely, behind the clubhouse. It was a leak, a deliberate secret leak in their system. And they were doing it in the middle of the night. As I watched the footage again, the man's shadow moving in the infrared glow, a memory surfaced. I thought of the long, lonely years after Martha passed away. I'd poured all my grief into this land, into this system. I remembered digging the trenches myself, my hands, already shaking a bit from an old injury from my time in the service, struggling to grip the shovel. But the work was sound. The lines were true. Every joint was sealed perfectly because it was for her, for this place. It was honest work. What I was watching on this screen was the opposite. A secret built on a lie, a theft hidden under the cover of darkness. I looked at the complicated valve system they'd built, the secret taps, the clumsy cover-up. I leaned back in my chair, and a dry chuckle escaped my lips. Bet these clipboard clowns couldn't install a simple shut-off, I muttered to the empty room, if their precious kombucha depended on it. They were so proud of their cleverness, so sure of their power. They had no idea they were just building the cage I was going to lock them in. The video from the trail camera was a start, but it was amateur proof. I needed something more. I needed data. Official data. I spent a morning digging through one of my old lockboxes until I found it. My county consultant ID card from 15 years ago. It was faded, and the picture made me look younger and a lot less tired, but the name and title were still clear. I picked up the phone and dialed the main number for the County Water and Resources Department. I didn't ask for a supervisor. I asked for a specific department, the hydrology lab, and when the receptionist answered, I used a tone I hadn't used in years, the voice of a man who belonged there. "Get me Sarah Jenkins," I said. "It's Nate Collier." Sarah was a young hydrologist, sharp as a tack, who I'd met at a conference a few years back. She remembered me. I didn't tell her the whole story. I just told her I was seeing anomalous pressure drops in the groundwater system that fed the District 7 emergency reserve. I told her the specific grid coordinates. I didn't mention the HOA. I just gave her the numbers. "That can't be right," she said. "Those cisterns should be at 95% capacity." That's what I thought too, I said. Could you run a remote pressure test? She hesitated for a second. It was an unusual request from a civilian. I still have my credentials, I said quietly. That was enough. An hour later, she called back. Her voice was different, tense. Nate, you were right. The pressure is dropping system-wide. It's slow, but it's steady. Something's drawing a huge amount of water out of the system without authorization. Something's wrong underground. I had my official confirmation. Now, it was time to set the trap. The hardest part was swallowing my pride. I walked down to the HOA office the next afternoon. Darla was there, of course, rearranging brochures in a rack. She looked up, and a flicker of annoyance crossed her face. I held up my hands in a gesture of surrender. Darla, I said, my voice quiet and tired. I can't fight you. I can't afford a lawyer, and I surely can't pay that fine. I let my shoulders slump. I made myself look like a defeated old man. I'm here to make peace. Maybe we can agree to arbitration? Work? Something out? A slow, triumphant smile spread across her face. It was the look of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. Well, Nate, she said, her voice full of false generosity. I think that's a very wise decision. I'll have our lawyer draw up the papers. She thought she had won. She thought I was broken. That's exactly what I wanted her to think. The moment I got home, I made another call. This one was to a number I knew by heart. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. Dobbins. Mike Dobbins and I served together in the Army Corps of Engineers. We'd kept in touch over the years. After the Army, he'd gone into journalism, the investigative kind, chasing crooks and exposing corruption for a national news syndicate. Mike, it's Nate, as I said. How'd you like a story about a little HOA that got too big for its britches and accidentally hijacked a county's emergency water supply? There was a pause, then a low chuckle on the other end of the line. Nate, you always did know how to bait a hook. I'll be there tomorrow. Mike arrived in a beat-up Ford pickup with more rust than paint, but the back was full of Pelican cases packed with professional-grade equipment. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, we went up to the spring. We weren't just planting a trail camera this time. We installed a discreet solar-powered flow monitor on the diversion pipe, a device that measured every gallon being siphoned off. We placed wireless pressure sensors at key points, all feeding data to a small receiver I could monitor from my workshop. We were building a case made of cold, hard numbers. Mike stood there, looking at the scarred earth. She really thinks she's a queen, doesn't she? He said, shaking his head. Petty tyrants are the worst. They have all the ambition of a dictator and a kingdom the size of a parking lot. My victory felt close, but bureaucracy has a way of killing momentum. The next day, Sarah, the hydrologist, called me back. Her voice was frustrated. Nate, I've filed the report, but my supervisor is kicking it up the chain. They're saying they're too backlogged with permit inspections. They can't launch a formal investigation for at least 60 days. 60 days. In 60 days, my orchard would be dead. The damage would be irreversible. It was a gut punch. I was on my own again. And Darla, feeling secure in her victory, decided to celebrate. She sent out flyers for a big community appreciation BBQ to be held on the shore of her brand new spring-fed pond. I watched from a distance as they set up tables and fired up grills. The whole time, a tanker truck with the HOA logo on the side kept its hose in the pond, spraying down the dusty parking area to keep the dust off the cars of the board members. They were literally throwing my water into the air for show. Darla got up on a small makeshift stage with a microphone. She thanked everyone for their community spirit, and then unveiled her grand vision, a new, luxury wellness pavilion, complete with a yoga studio and spa to be built on the hill. A place of peace and tranquility for all residents, she announced. She pointed to where it would be, directly over the spring. She wasn't just stealing the water, she was going to entomb the source under a slab of concrete. I turned to walk away, the sound of polite applause ringing in my ears. I couldn't watch anymore. Just as I reached my porch, my phone rang. It was Sarah. Her voice was sharp, urgent, stripped of all professional calm. Nate, forget the 60 days. We have a much bigger problem. I've been running simulations on the diversion system based on the pressure readings. She took a breath. Their amateur setup. The pipes they used, the way they've tapped the main line without proper backflow preventers. Nate, there's a serious contamination risk. If there's any kind of pressure drop in the main county line, that pond water, full of fertilizer runoff and God knows what else, it's going to get sucked right back into the emergency reserve. My blood ran cold. I looked down the hill toward the BBQ, where people were eating and laughing, their children running through the grass. The water isn't just stolen, Sarah said, her voice low and grim. It's poisoned. The moment Sarah said the word poisoned, the game changed. This wasn't about my land anymore. It wasn't about fines or property lines. This was about public safety. The 60-day waiting period was a death sentence. I hung up the phone and walked straight back to my workshop, to those old steel filing cabinets. I wasn't looking for maps this time. I was looking for a contract. I knew it was there, buried deep in a folder labeled Municipal Contracts, 1987. I found it in the bottom drawer, a thick document bound with a rusted staple, the pages yellowed with age. It was the agreement I'd signed with the county when I designed and built the emergency system. My eyes scanned the dense legal text until I found the paragraph I was looking for. It was a fail-safe, a clause I had insisted on myself, a little piece of bureaucratic dynamite I had planted 30 years ago and forgotten about until now. The clause stated that the spring, designated as a critical intake for the county emergency reserve, must remain untouched and unaltered for any non-essential purpose. If it was ever tampered with, or if its primary function was compromised, all subordinate land use claims, easements, and amendments would be rendered immediately null and void, and legal ownership of the source and its immediate surrounding land would revert to the original custodian, to me. I made 2 copies. The first one, along with a short, simple letter explaining the situation, I sent by certified mail to the HOA Board of Directors, addressed directly to Darla Crenshaw. The second copy, along with Sarah's preliminary pressure readings and a note from a concerned citizen, I hand-delivered to the editor of the local paper. I didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, the headline was on the front page, right below the fold. Local HOA taps county emergency water reserve to fill private pond. The story was cautious, but the facts were undeniable. The county confirmed the pressure drop. The HOA, when asked for a comment, gave a blustery non-denial denial. The phone at the HOA office started ringing. Then the phones at the county supervisor's office started ringing. Suddenly, my problem was everyone's problem. The public pressure was immediate and intense. The county, which had been content to sit on its hands for 60 days, was now forced to act. They didn't just order an investigation. Citing a public health emergency, they ordered the HOA to hold an open board meeting, accessible to all residents, to address the allegations. Darla tried to refuse, calling it a private matter, but she had lost control. The tide had turned. The meeting was held in the HOA clubhouse, the very building her stolen water was meant to beautify. The room was packed. It wasn't just the usual HOA members. It was farmers from the unincorporated county, volunteer firefighters, young mothers holding babies, people who had read the article and understood that their safety had been gambled away for a decorative pond. The air was thick with anger and anxiety. Darla and her board sat at a long table at the front, looking besieged. She tried to open the meeting with her usual procedural nonsense, but the crowd wasn't having it. Then I walked in. I wasn't alone. With me was Sarah, the county hydrologist, holding a briefcase, and behind me was Mike Dobbins, my old Army buddy, with a press pass hanging around his neck and a cameraman in tow. We didn't take seats. We walked right to the front of the room. I was carrying a large, rolled-up schematic under my arm. It was a simplified diagram of the water system, one I'd drawn myself, big, clear, and easy for anyone to understand. 2 lines, one blue, marked community drinking water, and one red, marked HOA pond, and a big ugly valve connecting them. "My name is Nate Collier," I said, my voice echoing in the suddenly silent room, "and this woman," I pointed a finger directly at Darla, "has been lying to you." A gasp went through the crowd. Darla's face went white, then a blotchy red. "This is a private meeting. You are out of order," she sputtered. "This is a public health emergency," Sarah cut in, her voice firm and official. And as a representative of the county water department, I'm ordering you to let him speak. The room was mine. I unrolled the schematic and taped it to the wall. With a marker, I showed them where the spring was and how it was supposed to feed the emergency system. Then I showed them the illegal diversion. For months, I said, the HOA has been siphoning off 70% of your backup drinking water, the water you need for fires, the water you need if the main pumps fail. I turned to Mike's camera. But it gets worse. I wanted to show everyone just how much water we're talking about. So we ran a little test. I pulled a small laptop from my bag and connected it to a projector. On the screen, a live feed appeared. It showed the data from the flow monitor Mike and I had installed. A number ticked upwards in real time, the gallons of water being diverted per minute. The number was staggering. A low murmur of outrage swept through the room. Darla jumped to her feet. "This is fake news," she shouted, her voice shrill. "It's a doctored video. This is a private matter between a disgruntled homeowner and the association." She was losing them, and she knew it. The crowd started to stir. A woman in the back stood up, her face pale with fury. "A private matter?" she yelled. "My son has been sick for a week. The doctor couldn't figure out why. Our water has been brown and tastes like dirt." Another man shot to his feet. "Our pressure is so low I can't water my livestock." The shouts started coming from all over. The carefully constructed world of order and control Darla had built was collapsing around her, right here in front of everyone. Her smugness was gone, replaced by a desperate cornered look. The room was turning on her, and I hadn't even shown them my best card yet. As the shouts grew louder, I held up a hand. The room quieted, expecting the next blow. I didn't raise my voice. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. "Darla claims this is all a misunderstanding," I said, my gaze locked on hers. "She claims this was all done for the good of the community. She claims she didn't know." I paused, then turned back to the laptop and clicked a file. "But some things aren't done for the community. Some things are done in the middle of the night." On the projector screen, the live data feed vanished, replaced by the grainy black and white footage from my trail camera. The room was dead silent as they watched the contractor sneak onto my land at 2 a.m. They saw him uncover the hidden valve. They watched as he cranked it open, diverting even more water into the secret pipe. There was a collective gasp. It was undeniable. It wasn't incompetence. It was a conspiracy. The man whose son was sick pointed a shaking finger at the screen, his voice raw with fury. "You didn't just steal our water," he yelled, his voice cracking. "You poisoned my family. You did this in the dark, like a thief." The room erupted. The shouting was no longer just angry murmurs. It was a roar. The board members at the table with Darla began shifting in their seats, their faces pale, trying to distance themselves from her. Darla's smugness finally, completely shattered. She looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting from the angry faces in the crowd to the damning evidence on the screen. I let the chaos swell for a full minute. I wanted her to feel it. I wanted her to feel the weight of every lie, every threat, every drop of stolen water. When I spoke again, my voice cut through the noise like a knife. "It doesn't matter anymore," I said calmly. The room fell silent again, hanging on my every word. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folded copy of the 1987 municipal contract. I held it up. "According to the original agreement signed with this county, this spring is a protected resource. This document states that if its integrity is ever compromised, all other claims become void." I looked directly at Darla. Her face was a mask of disbelief. "That means your HOA's land use amendment is invalid. Your easement is invalid. The fines you've issued are invalid." I let the words sink in. "Your pond, your new pavilion, your entire development plan. It's all built on a foundation of sand. It's all worthless." For a moment, nobody moved. Then, the realization swept through the crowd like a shockwave. A farmer in the back started clapping, slowly at first, then faster. Someone else joined in, and then another. Within seconds, the entire room was filled with the sound of applause. It wasn't just for me. It was for themselves. It was the sound of people taking their power back. The county representative, a man who had been standing quietly at the back of the room, now strode to the front. He took the microphone from the table. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice booming with authority, The Oak Ridge Meadows HOA is ordered to cease and desist all access to the spring and its related systems. The county is taking over management of this resource, pending a full criminal investigation. Reporters swarmed the front of the room, flashbulbs popping, microphones thrust toward Darla's face. Her composure broke. Sweat beaded on her forehead. "This is a witch hunt!" she shrieked into the chaos. "This is slander! I demand this meeting be adjourned." But nobody was listening to her anymore. A woman from the HOA board, a quiet librarian type named Lois, who had never spoken a word, stood up. She looked at Darla with pure contempt. "Adjourn?" she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Darla, you're not in charge anymore. You're under investigation." That was the final blow. Darla stared at her, her mouth hanging open. The reporters surged forward. Mike's camera was right in her face, capturing every flicker of fear and desperation. She tried to push through the crowd, shouting, protesting, but her words were lost in the roar of the mob she had created. As she was being cornered by the press, I walked over to the microphone she had left on the table. I picked it up. My eyes found hers through the scrum of reporters. She looked at me, and in her eyes, I saw the complete and total collapse of her tiny empire. I raised the microphone and said the words she had said to me just weeks before, the words that had started this whole thing. I looked her right in the eye and said, "This community doesn't belong to you anymore." The room exploded in cheers. It was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. The fallout from that meeting was swift and brutal. Mike's news story went national. The video of Darla's meltdown, captured in high definition, was played on news channels across the country. She became the face of HOA overreach, a walking, screeching meme. But her real trouble had just begun. In her panic, she made a final, fatal error. She went to the HOA office late that night and tried to alter the official board meeting minutes and delete financial records related to the pond and the new wellness pavilion. She didn't realize that after the public meeting, the county had frozen all HOA assets and records. When she tried to access the server, it triggered a silent alarm with the county sheriff's department. They caught her red-handed, a USB drive in her hand, trying to scrub the evidence of her reign. Mike called me the next morning. "They got her on tampering with evidence and a half-dozen potential fraud charges," he said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. "She tried to play God with a clipboard, and now she's going to learn about real rules in a real courthouse." She was done. Her petty kingdom had crumbled to dust. With Darla facing criminal charges, the rest of the HOA board resigned in disgrace within the week. The county appointed an interim manager, a no-nonsense professional whose only job was to untangle the legal mess Darla had created and ensure essential services continued. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed overnight. It was like a long, low-grade fever had finally broken. People started talking to each other again, not about violations and fines, but about their gardens and their kids. The fear was gone. But old habits die hard. A few nights after Darla's arrest, I was woken by a bright flash of light from the back of my property. I didn't get a shotgun. I just picked up my phone. After the gravel was dumped in my well, I'd upgraded my little trail cam setup. I'd installed motion-activated floodlights and a high-resolution camera that fed directly to my phone. On the screen, blinking in the sudden, harsh glare of the lights, was the same contractor from the trail cam video. He was holding a pair of heavy bolt cutters, standing right over my main waterline where it entered my property. He was frozen, like a deer in the headlights. The police were there in under 5 minutes. They found a text on his phone from Darla's right-hand man, Ken Bradwell, the self-important security guard, offering him $500 to finish the job. They both ended up with a list of charges to match their boss. The justice that followed was quiet and complete, the way it should be. The new resident-led HOA board held its first meeting, and their first motion was to publicly apologize to me and my family. Their second was to repay every penny of the bogus fines Darla had levied against our neighbors. Their third, and most important, was to vote to dissolve the aggressive bylaws that had allowed this nightmare to happen in the first place, returning the association to its simple, original purpose, maintaining the roads and nothing more. The county, for its part, made things right. In a small ceremony at the courthouse, they presented me with a document that officially designated me as the lifetime steward of the spring, with a conservation easement that would protect it forever. They awarded me a settlement for damages to my property and for the legal costs I never actually had, thanks to Mike. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. I used a part of that settlement to buy and install new, high-grade water filtration systems for the Millers, the Garcias, and a few other families who had gotten sick from the tainted water. Old Man Miller shook my hand, his eyes watery. "You didn't have to do this, Nate," he said. "Yes, I did," I told him. "This was never just about my water. It was about ours." That summer, when my granddaughter Hope came to visit, the land was healing. The wildflowers by the spring were back, thicker and brighter than ever. The water in my tank was full, the pressure strong and steady. We put up a new hand-carved wooden sign at the head of the trail. It didn't say Collier Spring, it said Hope Water Hill. A few days ago, Hope and I were sitting on the big flat rock next to the spring, the same one Martha and I used to sit on. The water ran clear and cold over the stones, making a sound like quiet laughter. Hope, who is 10 now and understands more than I give her credit for, looked at the steady stream of clean water bubbling up from the earth. "Grandpa," she said, "did you have to fight those mean people to save the water?" I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the maps, the cameras, the contracts, the public humiliation of a woman who thought she was a queen. I thought about how she had tried to bury this place, and how, in the end, she had only buried herself. I looked at the strong, steady flow that had been here long before any of us, and would be here long after we were gone. "No, honey," I said, putting my arm around her. "I didn't have to fight. Sometimes the old ways still work. You just gotta know where to dig."